Bombs raining down on cities in an established European democracy of 44 million people has provoked an astonishingly fierce resolve by the people of Ukraine. It's also testing the post-Cold War era alignments around the world as never before. Let's find out how. With us from Vienna, Austria, Velina Chakarova, director of the Austrian Institute for European and Security Policy. In Washington, D.C., David Frum, staff writer at The Atlantic. In Ontario's capital city, in the Annex, Janice Stein, Belzberg Professor of Conflict Management and founding director of the Munk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy at U of T, and Doug Saunders, international affairs columnist with the Globe and Mail. And we thank all of you for joining us here on TVO tonight. Velina, you are, of course, the closest to the battlefield right now, so I do want to start with you. Have you noticed a fundamental shift in how Russia is executing its war effort at the moment?
Well, first and foremost, let me be very clear that almost nobody had expected a full-fledged war being launched by Russia against Ukraine, an unprovoked war. We spoke on this program, and I anticipated a military attack, a limited military operation. But what we are observing right now is a full-scale military reinvasion by Russia against Ukraine, which is taking place simultaneously in the north, in the west, and in the south. And right now we are in the second phase of this war, a more severe phase, which has already witnessed a lot of casualties on both military and civilian side. And unfortunately, the way the war is being conducted by Russia reveals actually the true goals by the Russian president, namely the complete subjugation of Ukraine. And this was also basically what the Ukrainian president announced today.
Let me follow up with Janice Stein on that, because Janice, I think Velina's right in as much as most of the predicting we heard before this thing started was that it was going to be a limited incursion, limited to eastern Ukraine, the taking in of those two provinces. This is way beyond that. Why didn't we see this coming?
I think we didn't see it coming, Steve, because this is so damaging to the future of Russia. The consequences are far-reaching. It will, in many ways, change the trajectory of Russia's future. And what people missed, frankly, and we shouldn't have, given the article that Putin published this summer, is how obsessive he is on this subject, how far-reaching his goals are, and how determined he was, frankly, to eliminate this government of Ukraine. And a limited incursion just wouldn't do that. So we have the tragedy for Ukraine is unimaginable, but this is a tragedy for Russia as well.
And yet, having said that, Doug, we are seeing accounts that the Russian soldiers were ill-prepared for the fierceness of the defense that they have run into. There were other soldiers who were quoted as having said, oh, we thought we were just going on, doing the rounds. We didn't realize we were launching an all-out invasion of another country. What are we to make of those kinds of bizarre statements?
I think there was nothing inevitable or necessary about this invasion by Russia of Ukraine. The fact that the soldiers and even many of the officers who were massed at the borders of Ukraine in Russia and Belarus in advance of this did not know that they were going to be conducting a full invasion and takeover of a sovereign country indicates that. And we need to be careful to realize that Vladimir Putin's justifications for this that he listed repeatedly over the last year and on the day of the invasion don't make sense. The idea that there is a threat to Russia from NATO's existence in Central Europe or Ukraine's desire to join the European Union don't make any sense at all. The only logic behind it is a desire not to have an independent country next door to Russia. And I think that took even the military officers by surprise and is causing them to react in confused ways.
All right, David, I wanted you to have a chance to hear all of those comments and then react to how you would characterize the Western response to this appalling invasion of Ukraine's sovereignty. What do you think?
Well, I have been focusing my work on exactly that, the financial and economic response in Western capitals. And I'll just give you a sense of the speed and power of what has happened. I began last Wednesday talking to economists about what might happen. And I began talking to people, and they would say, well, this is kind of out there. But here are some of the things that could happen. So I wrote a story, which I was finishing up on Saturday morning, about what might happen. And I said to my editor, who has small children, you don't have to work this weekend, because let's not publish this till Monday, because these things are so out there, it's unlikely they would happen. At 2:30 that Saturday afternoon, the European Union did everything I had talked about. And at 5:30 that Saturday afternoon, the U.S. Federal Reserve joined in. These are the most devastating financial sanctions in the history of the world. And I think they took the Russians by surprise, because Putin thinks like a gangster. He thinks like a warlord, and he doesn't understand how modern finance works, the idea that you can heap up a pile of gold and then you have your war chest with which to go invade your neighbors, as if this were the Middle Ages, that works anymore. I don't think he understood quite what could be done. He didn't understand how integrated, if you want to have a convertible currency, if you want to be able to eat fruit in winter, if you want your citizens to be able to travel, if you want to have weapon systems that rely in any way on advanced technology rather than whatever comes out of the factories in Minsk, you are integrated into a world economy. And the people and the central banks that govern the major currencies have enormous power over you. I talked to a Soviet-born economist now at Stanford, who coined a saying that you never fight with the people whose currencies you use to back up your own currency. And that sounded a bit of a mouthful. A reader helpfully abridged it. Never put your savings in someone else's mattress. That's what the Russians had done. And Putin thought that he could just reach into that mattress and take the savings out whenever he wanted to. And he got a rude surprise.
Well, having said that, let me do a quick follow-up with you, and that is the so-called SWIFT global financial system that Russia is a part of. Apparently, it's a bridge too far to kick them out. What do you think of that?
SWIFT is the least of it. SWIFT is a messaging system. SWIFT is a privately owned entity that allows banks to move money around. And if you've ever sent an international wire, you've relied on it. That is not what hit the Russians so hard. What hit them hard was the sanctioning by the central banks, the two big ones, the Fed and the European Central Bank, and the two next ones, the Bank of England and the Bank of Japan, that made Russia had $630 billion in reserves, 139 in physical gold in a vault in Moscow, and the rest claims on other central banks. Monday morning, those $630 billion of reserves were effectively worthless. And the result was the ruble ceased to be a real currency. A currency is something you can use to buy anything. Now, the Russians can still do bilateral barter with China or North Korea or whoever will do business with them, but they can't do business on world markets, and their currency doesn't buy anything on world markets anymore.
This is an excerpt from a publication called Unheard.com, published just a couple of days ago. Velina, I'm going to get you to react to this first. Here it goes. Even if the West can find ways to inflict serious economic damage on Russia, that still does not mean sanctions will work. To be truly effective, they must also change the Russian government's behavior. And this is where the logic of sanctions often breaks down. It is remarkably rare for Western policymakers to explain or even consider exactly how economic pain is supposed to translate into political gain. And the prospects in this particular case do not look promising, so says the writer Lee Jones. Do you think, Velina, that the sanctions, as biting as David has just described them, can actually change Putin's behavior?
No, absolutely not. I think that the Russian president has factored in the sanctions, and I think that he has factored in full-scale, most severe, worst-case scenario of sanctions. And this is the most worrisome element of the assessment, because even then, he actually decided to make such a move on Ukraine. And I think that it is really kind of a different world we are living in, and we should be a little bit of contrarian, because on the one side, the West, of course, has introduced these severe sanctions, and rightly so. This was absolutely necessary to be done. But on the other side, China has zero intentions to impose any sanctions on Russia. Russia is going to become even more dependent on the Dragon Bear, what I described as a systemic coordination between Moscow and Beijing in the most relevant strategic domains. And Russia, I think, is now planning to turn completely towards Asia, Africa, Latin America. We've observed already quite of a suspicious behavior also by other international partners. The Brazilian president was going to Moscow in the middle of a military escalation to make deals on fertilizers. Right now, Pakistan just sealed the first deal amid a war by Russia against Ukraine, securing wet and natural gas from Russia. So I think that we are going to observe a continuous process of what I described as bifurcation of the global system. We are meanwhile living in two parallel worlds. And I think that Russia made this move on Ukraine. I myself didn't see it coming, but Putin really intends to give a birth to a new revisionist imperial geopolitical project by denying Ukraine the very existence as a sovereign and independent state and uniting it together with Belarus within something that he probably will call a union state, where we will see Russian troops, Russian nukes, and Russian military bases very soon if he is successful with this endeavor.
We will come back to that a little bit later. Janice, I do want you, though, to pick up on this well-worn expression that we should never underestimate the capacity for the Russian people to endure more and more suffering. And I wonder whether Putin is counting on that to get him through all of this.
Yeah, I think certainly he's counting on that, but I think the situation is a little more complicated from two perspectives. Steve, one, just briefly about China. I'm not one of those who believes that China is going to rush to Russia's either economic defense here or political defense. Already there are suggestions by the Chinese foreign minister that they be a possible intermediary between Ukraine and Russia. What is happening is deeply disturbing to the Chinese, who are heavily invested in a global order where they have a larger and larger stake. They want to run some of those institutions, and they're fierce competitors, but they disapprove, frankly, in a very deep way of what Russia has done. And Russia may turn into an enormous burden for China over these next few years. So I don't see this natural evolution of a closely knit alliance. Secondly, on the sanctions, the Russian public is long suffering, and we've seen very courageous Russians, 6,500, are already in jail as a result of protests, because for them, they are fighting their brothers. And that's why Doug's point about the stunning surprise for soldiers who find they're fighting their brothers explains a great deal. They were not prepared for that. But that's not where the leverage points are. The leverage points are with the oligarchs, and we've had two speak out recently. A third one has stepped up and offered to mediate between Russia and Ukraine, which says they are already feeling the pain. And the real action, and Putin showed us this, is with the generals and the senior security officials. In those televised theatrical productions, staged productions, he made them own this invasion. He effectively asked every one of them to declare their support. When the going gets really tough, either economically or even on the ground, because, and one final point here, yes, Russia may do a deal with Pakistan, but Russia, like every other advanced economy, needs high technology imports. There is a total freeze now on technology exports to the Russian economy. That will hit hard, and will hit the security services hard, and it will hit the army hard. There is limited tolerance, even among those circles. It may not be in time to save Ukraine, but it will inflict huge damage on Russia that we cannot begin. I agree with David. These are the most punishing economic sanctions we've ever seen against a developed economy.
You used the expression saving Ukraine, and Doug, I'd like you to pick up the story there. Ukraine has asked for admission to the European Union. How should the European Union, Doug, react to that?
Well, remember, this crisis began when the people of Ukraine massed up and expressed their desire to get on the pathway to joining the European Union in 2014, rejecting the Putin-friendly president who'd been elected in 2010 and his desire not to get on the EU accession path. There's absolutely no reason why Ukraine could not have been joining the European institutions and also be a member of Vladimir Putin's so-called Eurasian Union of aligned states with Russia. There's no reason why a country could not be in both circles, except for the fact that Vladimir Putin would not tolerate that. And that is what began the response to the 2014 uprisings, the invasion of Crimea and eastern Ukraine. So this is fundamentally an issue about the European Union. I think Ukrainians recognize that their country is not going to be ready to join immediately. It doesn't have the economic and institutional stuff together to do it. But the signals we've been getting from Brussels about allowing Ukraine to get on the accession path immediately are a strong sign of support. And I believe that they offer what you could call a carrot as well as the stick of sanctions. We need to accompany economic punishments of Russia with positive inducements to Ukraine and also to Russia. We need off-ramps to these things. On the issue of sanctions, I should say we need to look at the example of what we did with Iran on the single issue of nuclear research. We created a regime, the JCPOA, which didn't just impose sanctions and economic punishments, but created an off-ramp for the end of sanctions and punishments if conditions were met. That's not going to drive Putin out of power or make him stop invading Ukraine, but it means that the pain being suffered by the Russian middle class, who will be the predominant people suffering from sanctions and cut off from SWIFT networks and so on. I mean, so many Russian business people depend on the SWIFT banking network to run their businesses. So many middle-class Russians have their mortgages with Western banks using SWIFT transactions and that sort of thing. People need to know that the pain they're feeling is not a punishment of them by the West, but is a result of the actions by their leader. And if sanctions can cause the population and maybe even senior figures to turn against that leader, Vladimir Putin, then they're successful. They're a very blunt instrument, so there does need to be a lot of good messaging and a lot of off-ramps available.
David, can I get you to react to that notion that we need to offer Russia some off-ramps just in case?
Russia was offered so many off-ramps before the shooting started, and after this comes to whatever end it is, we'll need to find ways to give Russia aid and help and to reconstruct. But at this point, this is not the time for off-ramps. The state is in the hands of someone who's driving past every off-ramp. No, this is the time for a more decisive result. I agree with the piece you quoted about the limited ability of sanctions to change behavior. And if these economic sanctions, devastating as they are, were all that was being done, Russia could impose enough repression and suffering on its own people to win the war on the battlefield. But they are not all that is happening. We've all seen those images of Russian convoys from the air coming from American satellites. Russia has air superiority, but Ukraine has space superiority. Every piece of equipment that the Russians have is visible to the Ukrainians night and day. That's not true in reverse. And if, by the way, some of Ukraine's friends start jamming, they have superior cyber capabilities, we don't know whether Russia is seeing anything at all. Russia has, however much equipment they have a finite number of tanks. The Ukrainians have an infinite number of Javelin missiles. They have borders open with NATO countries. Russia is starting an insurgency with a country that has not only defense in depth, but defense in depth with the depth being NATO countries, Poland and Romania, who are deeply emotionally committed to the Ukrainian cause and where Russia cannot respond. We're hearing about the morale of Russian soldiers. However little they are paid, their pay has become that much more worthless since Monday. They're basically fighting for no pay at all. And I don't know whether these are authentic images, but we've seen lots of images of Russian soldiers eating rations that are dated to 2015. So just the weight of economic power behind the Ukrainian cause. It's not that, again, that with the sanctions, with that's not enough to turn on the battlefield. But the real question is, how long does this not enormously large Russian army, how long does it remain an effective fighting force? I'm sure there are units that are very committed, and there are people who've committed atrocities that mean that they have no escape. But if the rank and file Russian soldier isn't being paid, isn't being fed properly, has a sense that the war isn't going well, and if they all know that on the other side they face not punishment, but if they can find a way to get over to the other side, they can walk into Europe and get a job and be paid in pounds and euros. That's not going to happen right away, but I think that when you think, what does the end game look like? I think it looks more like the Russian army on the ground dissolving than it looks like infinite repression or Russia, quote unquote, taking over cities. I mean, as many generals you see on the cable network say, if you arrive in a city with of many millions of people with a few thousand soldiers and you put vehicles there, you're just parking. You're not occupying the city. And it is going to be, I mean, they may level it. They may try to do a Grozny and just pummel Ukrainian cities into submission. But again, you wonder, what is the reaction on a Russian army that has been, where everyone has been taught since infancy that Kiev is the cradle of Russian civilization, if they're in the army that pounds Kiev into rubble?
Well, let me move this up to the next level, if I can put it that way. And that is, and Velina, let me get you to start with this. Maybe the most chilling thing we've heard during this whole attempt to occupy Ukraine was Putin musing the other day about the use of nuclear weapons. Now, if he, in fact, does use tactical nuclear weapons in this war, what do we do?
First, he used the threat of tactical nuclear weapons already during the military escalation, and when he was also placing his demands on the table, the demands to the United States and NATO. So this is not a new element. Second, the very fact that NATO did not show to be really worried about it, it means also that it's a part now of the verbal escalation rather than a true intention. Third, occupation of Ukraine has never been on the table. 190,000 troops cannot occupy such large country, as large as France, and 44 million people. So, which actually brings me to the thought, and this is where my biggest fear is that the Russian president will really seek for a scenario where he will try to crash the will for resistance and will seek to remove the political establishment and replace it with a puppet government in Kiev. And if that does not work, he will go also for a scenario to split the country from the north to the south, where he basically will turn Ukraine into a sea-locked country with no access to the Black Sea, no access to the Sea of Azov, and then having also the two regions, Lugansk and Donetsk, and then having also control of large territories along the Russian border with Ukraine. So horrible scenarios where I don't really see actually him using nuclear weapons. He does not need. He has plenty of other horrible scenarios at disposal right now.
Well, let me follow up with Janice on that, because Janice, if I understand this, one of the reasons that NATO and/or troops sympathetic to Ukraine's plight are not bombing those very vulnerable Russian positions that they can see plain as day from satellite photos. One of the reasons they're not doing that, one of the reasons they're not even setting up a no-fly zone, is that they're afraid that Putin will make good on this threat to use nuclear weapons. Is that reasonable?
I think it is a reasonable fear. It is really striking that he has talked about nuclear weapons. First of all, the day before he launched the invasion, he was in a missile command center where he was personally supervising the launch of a missile. He then talked in what is the most paranoid story you can imagine about Ukraine having an incipient nuclear weapon because, oh, by the way, it had Soviet nuclear weapons based in Ukraine, and therefore it had nuclear know-how. Now, how credible is that? But he went further. He then put his nuclear forces on the lowest stage of alert and then raised the stage of alert 2 days ago. He's gone up twice. So the Biden administration's response was not to do anything, not to go up the DEFCON chain in order to signal that they are trying to avoid escalation. And so I don't agree with you, David, that we don't have to design off-ramps here. Russia is a nuclear armed state led by somebody whose judgment I think every one of us would question at this point, pushed into a corner. And in fact, if the campaign on the ground is not going as well as he expected, those are the conditions. And I certainly know this from looking at prior wars and other leaders. When leaders feel cornered and pushed against the wall, that's when they escalate. And so and what the West is doing generally, and NATO in particular, they are threading a needle here. And it's very difficult and very challenging to do. Massive economic punishment, but they have to have off-ramps. Coercion doesn't work unless you say, a threat only works if you say, but if you stop doing this, then the following will happen. There's nobody in the Biden White House now who wants to take the risk of a miscalculated use of nuclear weapons. It's not just using a tactical nuke on a battlefield, which, by the way, would be so devastating to Ukraine. It's breaking that taboo of using nuclear weapons in battlefield operations. The stakes, frankly, could not be higher here, and we have to build in off-ramps here.
David, I should give you a chance to respond to that.
Yeah, I think we have to be very careful about substituting theory, what is makes theoretical sense for what is actually going to happen in life. The off-ramps are all there until the day of the invasion, and there will be a time for them again in the future when there will be a time when there are negotiations. In the next while, it's not realistic. Putin is driving. He is escalating. He will use more savagery. That's as his war fails. So the only way you get to the point where any of that is relevant is by inflicting costs, not only economic costs but military costs. And that doesn't mean direct NATO involvement. That would be very counterproductive and I think probably unnecessary. The tactical goal or this operational goal should be to aim at the dissolution of the army, making sure that every Russian soldier knows that if we can't show that you personally have committed war crimes, there's a hot meal, a comfortable bed, 36-month Schengen visa, a train ticket, cell phone, prepaid, call your family, and you could be, you could get out of here and be on your way to a job in Barcelona or Hamburg or someplace pleasant, and earning money. And the goal is to try to make his army dissolve, at least the mass of it. It's not a big army, and it is going to be at an increasing technological disadvantage as compared to the Ukrainian forces as they get more and more aid from the West.
Doug, let me bring you into this now and talk about hearts and minds. I don't think there's any question at all, but that certainly for the Canadian people, if we can look at them for a second, their hearts, their minds are with Ukraine overwhelmingly. Every poll shows it. The question then becomes, can that continue when the price of gas goes up $1, $2, $3 a liter? What's your view?
The hearts and minds of the world are with the Ukrainian people now, but it's important to note also that the hearts and minds of people in most countries around the world and their governments have turned decisively against Vladimir Putin's form of authoritarianism and the danger that he poses. There is no more talk of trying to defang Mr. Putin's regime through economic engagement. Countries like Germany that until last week were making major business deals with Mr. Putin and his regime, theoretically in hopes of bringing them out of the cold, have now turned their back decisively on this. Germany this week reversed 50 years of Russia policy and economic policy and debt policy and military policy in order to confront this. So we have this change. a lot of people will ask, why didn't this happen before? And I think certainly after 2014, that's a legitimate question. Vladimir Putin has used the nuclear threat throughout his presidency to try to intimidate people out of confronting him. I was seated at the table with Vladimir Putin in 2008 when he threatened to re-aim his nuclear arsenal at European capitals in retaliation for NATO stationing radar bases in Poland and the Czech Republic. That did cause NATO to step back and keep its fingers off. So we've been playing to his tune, you could say, for quite some time in increasingly remote hopes that we'll be able to turn him around. That's now over. That's not going to come back. I was very pleased, as David points out, to see Joe Biden responding to his latest nuclear threat, not by counter-escalating, but by de-escalating, by saying we're not going to do this. There's not going to be a NATO war with Russia over Ukraine. That would have been equally true, I suspect, if Ukraine had joined NATO a decade ago. We would have still had no desire to have a direct military confrontation with a Russia led by an unstable figure like this, but we also at the same time would have a crisis involving the NATO treaty. So, as others have said, Vladimir Putin has succeeded during the last week in uniting the democratic world in a way that he has never done before. Somebody recently said Europe is not just more united with the Ukrainians and against Putin than it has been in years. It's more united in general now than it has been in years. This has caused the democracies of North America and Europe to come together in a unified policy, both militarily and in terms of economic and trade relations, in a way that hasn't happened during our lifetimes.
No,
so
true
yeah,
enough.
It's hearts and minds in a much larger sense.
True enough, but I do want to get back to this price of gas question because I can't speak for other countries, but I know I hear a lot of Canadians a lot of times complaining about the price of gas. And David, I did note that you put on Twitter the other day that the best thing anybody could do right now in Canada is to explain to their neighbors why paying higher gas prices is actually okay. Play it out for us. What do you mean?
Well, prices will go up. Russia is a major exporter of oil and of natural gas, and both Russia and Ukraine are major food exporters as well. So there's going to be a shock. We also need to understand the shock is going to be relatively limited. Gas, in the sense of gasoline, Russia's impact on world markets is not going to be so enormously large. The big pain is going to be the price of natural gas, the heating fuel that they sell into European markets. And North America, which is sitting on top of a lot of natural gas, is going to have to develop more ways to liquefy that gas and ship it into world markets, but that's not going to happen anytime soon. So it's going to be a painful season for European consumers of heating fuel, and their governments will have to help them. I think that the shock at the gas pump, the gasoline pump, it's going to be real, but it's not going to be so severe. I think the thing I am most worried about is what this is going to do to the price of food. Ukraine and Russia are both major exporters of grain and of various kinds of cooking oils. Again, Canadians will notice it at the supermarket. But for poorer countries, it's going to be much more than just, a blow at the checkout counter. It really can mean very important differences to people's standards of living. The largest importer of wheat in the world is Egypt. All across North Africa, there's heavy reliance on grain exports, but it's a world market. Even if you can find grain from somewhere else, and you can, the price is going to be higher, maybe by as much as 10% all over the world. And that's going to bear hard on people. But these are not unmanageable costs. It's going to take some government action. Egyptian grain consumers are subsidized by the state. They may need more subsidies. We may need some international aid packages. We may need, for countries like Tunisia and Lebanon, we may need some international aid packages. A country like India, another major importer of grain from Russia and Ukraine, can probably afford to help its own people. But yeah, this is going to be a worldwide economic shock. It is not going to be free for us. It is going to hurt us. And that's one of the reasons to hope that this can come to a rapid end, and that we can then, as Janice advised, work on reconstruction for both Ukraine and Russia. And the return of a real meaningful peace for that part of the world from which Russians benefit too.
All right, with a little over 5 minutes to go here, let me see if I can get two more issues on the table here. And Velina, let me ask this question to you. I got an email from a viewer just today who said, come on, I won't use the epithet that he used to describe me, but he said the United States would not stand for Russia making itself feel at home in Mexico, so why should we not expect the Russians to object to their adversaries, quote unquote, making themselves feel at home in Ukraine? What's the answer to that argument?
Well, in fact, that is quite of a widespread argument, and the very fact that we need to actually bring about a counter argument even now following these horrendous events is striking to me. I think that the United States needs to show, and is already showing, in fact, and we've listened to the State of Union speech by Biden, needs to show a very clear and very, very strong position when it comes to Ukraine, and it is a position that entails, of course, a financial support, military support. Of course, here the big problem is that United States cannot get militarily involved in Ukraine, and so does NATO. And this is something that the Russian president factored in. In a sense, of course, if NATO gets involved in this conflict, Putin will have a bonus point. Putin will argue, you see, this is why I made the move on Ukraine. But on the other side, I would actually use the argument that the Central and Eastern European countries, which were eager to join NATO immediately after the collapse of the Soviet Union, this was the number one priority in terms of security guarantees, to join NATO in order to avoid such scenario. No, in fact, Putin made the best case for those countries that are outside of NATO to, in fact, join the alliance. And finally, given the current global competition, which is going to increasingly shift towards the Indo-Pacific and East Asia, it's very important for the United States to not just show a strong stance, but also to be actively engaged in supporting Ukraine's resistance, because the worst case scenario for the United States from Washington's position would be a two-front scenario, a scenario where both Russia and China will be pressuring the United States diplomatically, politically, on the two main cases, the one being Ukraine, the other being Taiwan.
All right, let's come full circle then, Janice. Help us understand here. We heard Velina earlier in the program say that she thought the end goal for Putin here was to create a kind of a new Ukraine, Belarus, Russia, whatever you want to call that. And I wonder if you want to go further than that. Do you think Putin is trying to actually recreate the former Soviet Union with all of the other constituent republics as well, and he won't stop until he achieves that?
I think we all have to be very careful because none of us thought Putin was going to do what he just did. And that's sobering. And that's why I made that point about nuclear weapons. I didn't think Putin was going to launch an all-out invasion all over Ukraine 2 weeks ago. So I think we have to be cautious here and think about the things we never thought he might do. Now, what you just described, Steve, would frankly be insane. David's point that the Russian army is going to have all it can do to consolidate any territorial gains in Ukraine itself is a really valid point. But there's some nightmare scenarios here in which these big cities can be encircled and besieged by the Russian army and use artillery and firepower. We've all seen this. We just never thought we would see it in Europe again in our lifetime. Given how hard this is going to be, I really do not think, and the unequivocal hard line that both Biden has drawn and the Secretary General has drawn around every NATO country, that is not at the top of my list of worries right now. I would want to just return to one point that they've made that is so important, which is about wheat and the export of wheat. There's a role for this country. We are a wheat exporter. There are things we can do to organize international help, both financial and commodity based. There are countries in Africa and the Middle East that are truly going to suffer. Maybe Canadian consumers are going to complain about the price of gas at the pump, but that is nothing compared to the destabilizing impact of taking Ukraine, the grain basket of the world, frankly, out of global markets. This seems to me a no-brainer for this country to leave.
David, can I get you to weigh in on that issue? We know Putin has said in the past that he thought the greatest catastrophe of the 20th century was the dissolution of the Soviet Union. Do you believe he is trying to put that back together again?
I can't tell you what goes in through his head. I just know that every day his options are worse than they were the day before. And whatever he started off doing, by very soon he's going to be worried about saving his army and saving his neck. And I think it might be useful to think about what is everyone else's goal. And everyone else's goal is to restore peace to Europe and to see not only Ukraine, but Russia emerge as a normal country. One of the things that so-called realists say, and there's no one less realistic, there's no one more fanciful and dreamy and ideological than the person who calls himself a realist, is that the internal constitutions of countries do not matter for their external behavior. That's the core of so-called realist, what I'd call delusional foreign policy thinking. And what we have been reminded of again is the single most powerful predictor of a country's external behavior is its internal system. If Putin took a bad tumble tomorrow, this war would be over. If Putin had not come to power in the first place, this war would never have started. Russia could already be on its path to being a normal European country that provides a decent standard of living and political representation to its citizens. Let's hope that path of development resumes soon.
From top to bottom, Janice Stein, David Frum, Doug Saunders, Velina Chakarova, we're really grateful to the four of you for having such a smart and thoughtful conversation on TVO tonight. Many thanks and be well.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.